Whether it's through the Wild Trout Trust auctions or the annual get-together, there's no doubt about it that the organisation is a great way of meeting interesting people. And like this fella here, John Beer, I think I went fishing with him after winning a lot in the auction.
It was an auction,
yes,
wasn't it?
indeed.
That's right.
And we normally go out and about a few times each year. Haven't done it so far this year.
Well, we haven't been able to, have we?
No, because of COVID. A lot of people I know have been taking some time out by the seaside, catching bass on the fly. You ever done that?
I have.
How many have you had?
One.
Right, well, as far as I'm concerned, John Beer, you are an expert, as I have yet to do it. I tell you what, one man who most certainly is an expert on sea bass on the fly, and sea trout and brown trout, is David Pilkington, a guide from the Arundell Arms in Devon. He's been there, I think, half a century. Here's a little film about him.
I am David Pilkington. I have worked at the Arundell Arms Hotel at Lifton since 1976, the year of the famous drought, which was also the year I got married, so a monumental year in my life, and I've been here ever since. Fortunately, I got into the world of rivers quite early in my life. I started fishing in ponds at the age of 9 with some little snotty schoolboys from my junior school, and caught perch and roach and stuff on worms, which was great fun. Started fishing the rivers with my float tackle, which was the only thing I knew existed in those days, and caught a few trout. Realised quite early on that fly fishing was the only way a gentleman would proceed in life. Read every book in the public library about fly fishing, and I've been bonkers on rivers ever since. I caught my first trout on a fly, which was a dry fly that I had tied myself at the age of 11, and I can clearly remember to this day the place, the moment, the rise, the excitement. It stays with me still. Some very nearly, oh God, very nearly 60 years later, 59 years later. Yeah, my family had always holidayed in the West Country and loved the West Country, and an opportunity came for them to move down here. I was still at school, so I came down and we lived at Newton Abbot, or just near Newton Abbot. I went to Newton Abbot Grammar School when Newton Abbot had a grammar school. Started fishing on the Tin and the coast there, sea fishing on the coast. And then after a couple of years, left school, managed to get a job as a trainee water bailiff in Launceston with the Cornwall River Authority, which got me into this area, to know the rivers, to know the people, and taught me so much about what the fish did. We ran hatcheries, we trapped salmon for artificial propagation. God, those were cold days. There was a much greater bailiff force in those days, and enforcement of the law was taken a lot more seriously than it seems to be today, unfortunately. We were chasing poachers wholesale, we were chasing netsmen on the estuary, and it is a sad fact to record that the only cases I ever got to court were of licensed salmon netsmen who were either fishing in the weekly close time with the wrong size net mesh, or right out in the middle of the close season in the winter on the Camel. And these were guys who were licensed, authorised netsmen. A bit demoralising, really. And the rivers were poached, spawning fish were poached off the reds by local farmers. It was just a sort of national pastime in those days. I mean, I'm going back 50 years. That has changed. 2 reasons. Not so many salmon, and they've all got cars, they've all got computers, they've all got mobile phones, they have different interests, but there's still 1 or 2 who do it, and I know 1 or 2 of them, and I frighten them occasionally. Oh, it has to be said that the number of young people coming into fishing today is nothing like what it used to be, and that is not a good future to look at, because they are the future. We at the Arundell Arms Hotel are very interested in teaching fly fishing. It's the core of our business, and we are particularly interested in encouraging youngsters to fish, getting them interested in the whole countryside thing, which a lot of them don't get involved with now. You know, everybody, or so many people, live an urban lifestyle, and they're detached from nature and the reality of life to such an extent. What has been so nice for me over the years, because I've taught hundreds, thousands of people to fish in the time I've been here, and you take somebody down on the riverbank and not just let them watch the flowing water and see a dun hatch or see a spinner come down and lay its eggs, but show them where a thrush has smashed a snail shell on a stone, or find the tracks of a mink or an otter in the mud. And some of them, their eyes just light up at this. And if they see a kingfisher or a damselfly, it's magic. And a lot of people get that, thank goodness, and that does give me hope for the future. But we need to get people more aware of the world in which we live, and of course how we also as human beings have no choice but to be completely and utterly interlocked into that. And if we mess up the environment for one thing, we are messing it up for ourselves. And we're getting very good at messing it up on quite a large scale these days. It is nice to know that the brown trout, which basically is also the sea trout, are doing fine. Our trout catches have held up very well. The runs of sea trout are still holding up pretty well. And the one fish that has definitely started to become more significant on the Arundell Arms fishery and the tamer system in general here is the grayling. When I first came to fish these rivers, grayling were not quite regarded as vermin, but they weren't regarded with any interest at all. Nobody fished for grayling in the winter months, although it was always quite legal to do so. They were just something you might have caught by accident when you were trout fishing. One of the water bailiffs to whom I was apprenticed back in the 60s, dear old Bill Sprent, who was the bailiff on the Tavy, Walcombe and Plym area, he used to spin for salmon on the tamer, and he caught a 3.5 pound grayling on a Mepps one day, which is quite a fish. But the grayling seemed to be doing better and better, whether that's because we tend to have dry springs when they spawn without floods and their eggs hatch better, I don't know. But there is also more interest in the grayling. More people are fishing for them through the winter months. And if you catch a trout by accident, you simply put it back. I catch quite a lot of trout. I catch quite a few sea trout, both pre-spawning fish and then after Christmas catch sea trout kelts on the grayling nymph. And I have caught 3 salmon on the grayling nymph, which is quite fun, on a 8.5 foot 4 or 5 weight rod and a bit of 3 pound nylon. And the best fish was 8.5 pounds, caught on bonfire night, and he was as fresh as a daisy and fought like a sea trout, went completely berserk. Quite a memorable fish. Well, the Arundell Arms has been a fishing hotel since the 1930s. The pub was a coaching inn on what was the main road from Cornwall to London in those days, and has been here for a long time, but it became a fishing hotel in the 1930s. And at that time we rented fishing from local farmers and landowners, and a large slice of that was the Lifton Park estate, which owned all the 5 rivers that radiate into Lifton from different points of the compass. You can do a 2-mile radius from the hotel, you cross 5 rivers, and all of those belong to the Lifton Park estate. We rented their fishing at the time, and then in 1948, which is 2 years before I appeared on the planet, the fishing came on the market, and the hotel bought the water we have now on the Tamer, Lydd, Thrushall, Wolf and Carey, all of which is very local. And the main thrust of the fishing from the 1940s even to when I started here in 1976 was most emphatic on the wild brown trout. They were the target fish and were here in droves. We used to, in those days, it will sound terrible now, we would kill every season 2,500 or 3,000 wild brown trout, every one of which was over 8 inches in length. And that was the harvest we took off the river, and we did the same year in and year out for decades. I don't think you could do that today, and I don't think anybody would want to do that today, thank goodness. Everybody puts all their fish back now, and we're going to go completely catch and release for all species under our new ownership, which has to be the right way forwards. And you fish for the fun of catching the fish, enjoy it, put it back, hopefully it spawns, and the whole world carries on revolving sweetly. The Arundell Arms has been a fishing hotel since the 1930s. It was bought as a going concern by Anne and Gerald Fox Edwards in 1960, and they ran the hotel, got it really going as a fishing hotel, as a real destination. That hit the time when people became more mobile, more people had cars, more people had a bit of leisure time, so the sort of recreational side of things and interest in fishing was on the up. Roy Buckingham started at the hotel as fishing instructor and riverkeeper in 1969. That expanded the business completely. More people came to learn to fish, and that has been the core part of our business here really ever since. Gerald Fox Edwards sadly died in the very early 1970s, and then subsequently Mrs. Fox Edwards married Conrad Vos Bark. Conrad was the fishing correspondent for the Times newspaper, was a member of the Fly Fishers Club, had just written a book on fly fishing, fishing for lake trout. He fished a lot at 2 lakes in Hampshire. And at that point, Anne became much more interested in fishing. She and Conrad started to fish. Roy taught her to fish and to cast, and she cast beautifully for the rest of her life. And then in probably into the 80s, into the 90s even, early 90s, there was a decline in the water quality. There was a change in farming policy which had been instrumental in, things were definitely not as good. There was more dairy farming, much more intensive farming, activity that had never taken place within this catchment before. And the general decline of trout stocks was of concern. And Anne, Conrad, Michael Martin and Ted Hughes, with their respective partners, were having dinner at Lydd Cottage one evening discussing this, and they all said, well, why don't we just do something? And that was the germ of the Westcountry Rivers Trust, which has been the model on which rivers trusts around the country and indeed now around the world have been modelled. My son-in-law, Simon Evans, was one of the first members of the Westcountry Rivers Trust staff, which is how he met my daughter and how I now have grandchildren. And he's now Chief Executive of the Wye and Usk Foundation up in South Wales. He's a good boy. He's caught over 500 salmon, the bastard. When I came here first, I mean, we were fishing for wild brown trout. The sea trout fishing had never really been properly exploited, and we began to fish for sea trout at night with appropriate tackle and catching a good lot of sea trout, and became very famous as a sea trout venue, which we still are. And we caught a lot of salmon. We fished for salmon consistently. We spun for salmon. People killed their fish, took them home and ate them. It was just considered a normal thing to do. During the 1980s, 3 times in that decade, we caught over 100 salmon. And like everybody, we thought it was never going to end. And then all of a sudden, it just started to fizzle out. And the runs of salmon have declined not just here, but everywhere else over a period of time. And very sadly, in the year 2018, that's the first year I have never caught a salmon since 1968. Not a good year. I had one last year, thank God. In 1969, Roy and I shared a flat together as bachelors, and we did a lot of sea trout fishing, and we just about lived on sea trout through the summer months. And at the time, Roy's favourite fly was a black tube fly tied with a big hen hackle at the head, basically a stoat's tail, but it's tied with feather instead of fur, which stuck out a bit more, gave it quite a nice profile and outline in the water. And he caught plenty of sea trout on that. I'd already spent a year fishing on the Tin over in South Devon, where the favourite fly was the Alexandra tube. In fact, it was such a good fly that the lower Tin members would sidle up to you quietly, and they'd look round, make sure nobody was looking, and they'd just go, Alexandra tube, and then walk away pretending they hadn't spoken. So when I came to fish the Tamar Rivers in 1969 onwards, I fished with the Alexandra tube, caught a few sea trout, lost quite a lot of sea trout, and eventually decided that the tube fly, with its quite small treble, came out of fish quite easily. A lot of fish would be hooked, whiz around the pool, jump 2 or 3 times and come off. So I started fishing singles, and I found that big singles you'd still miss fish, you'd still lose fish, but fewer. And once they were hooked and they'd been on for those few seconds of early craziness, they tended to stay on. And I completely purloined Kingsmill Moore's bumble. Kingsmill Moore's bumble was a concept for fishing with variations of colour in variations of light for sea trout on the Irish lochs. But I found it a good night fishing fly and made a simple black bumble with a black body, a black hackle palmered up through, ribbed with a bit of silver twist, and a teal hackle wound at the head, which gave it a lot of mobility. And then I thought I needed something a little bit different, and I modified the good old Peter Ross, which is a cracking good sea trout fly anyway, tied it with a dark claret seal's fur front half of the body, and changed the teal wing to a mallard wing, which made it a bit more subtle, still a bit of sparkle with the tinsel in the body. And I used to use that one as a dropper fly in a slightly smaller size, and caught a lot of fish on both. So it's really, the PR is really just a shortened or a changed Peter Ross. And the black bumble, it was Kingsmill Moore's concept, and I've just nicked it neatly. Yes, after Anne Vospark's death, her son Adam Fox Edwards, her son from the first marriage, took over the running of the hotel, so the family continuity of the business carried on. Adam also became a trustee of the Westcountry Rivers Trust, because Mrs. Vospark had been, well, one of the absolute founding members of such a thing. And then we had the famous coronavirus, which didn't do our business much good. In fact, it killed it completely. Adam has since sold the hotel. We now have new owners, Simon Village and Arabella Munro, who are lovely folks, and they are really going to town on the place. There's a lot of work on the building, and they're very keen to continue the tradition of fishing that we have done for many, many years. We're looking to improve a lot of our water. We're looking to increase the number of children and young people we bring into fishing. So the future is looking extremely good. And at the age of 70, that's nice to be able to say.